what South Africa most needed as the alternative to apartheid was not a new form of racial and economic engineering, but a free and open democracy based very much on the principles of classical liberalism.
What was the People's War, and how do we understand the bloody reign of terror that was waged by the ANC on other black political organizations in the 1980s and 1990s? Well, somebody who's written extensively about this is Dr. Anthea Jeffery. She is the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations. She joined me on a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara, to discuss the life and legacy of Mr. John Kane Berman. If you would like to watch more tributes to Mr. John Kane Berman, you can do so by clicking on the link in the description below. Enjoy. So Anthea, you joined the IRR in 1990. That was a very tumultuous time in South Africa's politics. Could you give us a sense of the context of the time in which you joined the IRR and your relationship with John, both intellectually and professionally?
Absolutely. As you say, I joined in 1990. This was the year in which the state president, F.W. de Klerk, embarked on his bold liberalisation moves. He unbanned the ANC, the SACP, Umkhonto we Sizwe. He threw the door to democracy open. And I think there was a wide expectation that we would then embark on a period of greater stability, that there would be less violence than there had been in the 1980s. And the opposite happened. Political killings went up by 3 times. So the violence was far more intense in the early 1990s than it had been before. And so this was one of the issues that John wanted me to look at when I joined the IRR. And I quickly realized that John was not somebody to go with the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom was to blame this upsurge in violence on a third force. In other words, on elements of the police and the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP, working together to attack the ANC and to derail the transition. And John said to me, I don't think there's much evidence of this, and what evidence there is seems to crumble under scrutiny. So what other explanation can there be? And so I started, with his help, looking for the explanation. And a great deal of research took us in the end to the ANC's visit to Vietnam in October 1978, where the ANC had learned the formula for People's War, the mix of political and military struggles that you need to achieve various objectives. And 2 were particularly salient at this time. One was that this formula could be applied against political rivals, and the IFP was an enormously important political rival to the ANC, with far more support within the country than the ANC had ever had. And secondly, this formula could be applied to give the insurgent movement, to call it that, advantage in the negotiations process, to pretty much make sure that the negotiations would take place on terms that suited the ANC in our context. And the more one looked at the formula for People's War, the ingredients of it, and what was happening on the ground in South Africa, the more you could see the parallels. Not perfectly, of course, with what had happened in Vietnam, but sufficiently strongly to really suggest that this was what the ANC was engaged in, an intensified People's War, so that it could further weaken the IFP before the first all-race election and put great pressure on the negotiations process, so that it was finally able to achieve what Joe Slovo called a famous victory in negotiations in November 1993. But this was not a popular view. So John faced resistance from within the organization. He faced criticism from without, and he faced always the danger that funders might have less interest in supporting the IRR if we were following a track that was not the conventional one. But John always felt very strongly that you must go where the evidence leads. You must write up the research as the evidence shows you is correct, and you must have the courage to stick to it, even if it's not difficult, not easy to do it. And that was just so typical of John. And I valued enormously that he supported me through all that work, and that we were able to bring out a number of important books. I think of his own little monograph called Political Violence in South Africa, which came out in 1993, which was an important critique of the third force theory in particular. And then what I was later able to do in writing about the Natal violence and bringing out a book which really laid out all the elements of People's War. But there was other things going on too, particularly we were getting closer to the moment of transition to 1994. And the ANC was likely to achieve a great deal of domination over the new South Africa, which was what the People's War was intended to achieve. And what sort of policies would the ANC want to introduce? And John saw the risks in too much of a statist and interventionist approach. And he said that what South Africa most needed as the alternative to apartheid was not a new form of racial and economic engineering, but a free and open democracy based very much on the principles of classical liberalism, so that in the political sphere, there should be checks and balances on executive power. We should have the doctrine of the separation of powers. We should have a court able to use judicial review to strike down both legislation and executive conduct that was at odds with the Constitution. We should have a justiciable bill of civil liberties that were protected against incursion by the state. But in the economic sphere, we should also see that economic freedom was the other side of the coin to political freedom, and just as important. So therefore, there should be a focus not on state intervention, but rather on the kind of policies that would promote economic growth, that would encourage free enterprise, and particularly that would liberate the poor. And John saw that as both a moral and an economic imperative. He said the tendency in many countries was to treat the poor as a sort of separate category and then target them with wars on poverty, which often boiled down to any number of transfer payments, which built dependency rather than self-reliance and were ultimately often not sustainable. So he believed that in liberating the poor, you must help them to join the mainstream of the economy and escape from poverty in the same way as everybody else, by earning their own living. So what were the obstacles to that? What were the barriers to employment and upward mobility? And that led him to focus, as I did too, and quite a lot of my work, on the coercive labor laws that were pricing the unskilled and inexperienced out of the labor market, on the very poor quality of education that was not empowering people with the skills that they needed, that these were two critical areas which needed to be got right if you were to have the liberation of the poor. And also in the racial sphere, he very clearly saw that non-racialism is a principle that we should embrace immediately. It's in the Constitution as one of our founding values. And yet the ANC has always taken the view is that it's a distant goal to be achieved at some point when we've used enough racial classification and racial preferencing to bring about demographic representativity in every sphere. In other words, to make sure that people fan out into the economy and into the workforce strictly in accordance with their share of the overall population. And that's a goal that can never be attained. It never has been in any country around the world, because people are too intrinsically different. And you can't treat them as sort of blank slates and people can just be slotted in here and there. Much will always depend on individual characteristics, on education, on opportunities, and you need to put your focus on removing the barriers to upward mobility, not on the supposed norm of demographic representativity, which is completely a theoretical construct, not a reality in any society. And John said, so therefore we need non-racialism now, not at some point in the future. And hence his belief too that at most there might be a soft form of affirmative action where business would be conscious of the disadvantage that many people had experienced during apartheid, and there would be a process of training and mentoring and perhaps fast tracking to help people rise up to the corporate ladder, but you shouldn't have rigid racial quotas of the kind that the ANC has introduced and which have been so enormously damaging.
Thanks for watching. If you would like to learn more about Mr. John Kane Berman, his life and his legacy, you can do so by clicking here. You can also check out more long-form conversations on my other channel that's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.